It began with the kind of fact that makes even experienced investigators lower their voices. In the spring of 2000, a maintenance crew working along the Bonneville high-voltage corridor in rural Oregon noticed something at the top of a transmission tower. At first, they thought it was debris caught on the steel lattice, maybe a torn tarp lifted by the wind. But when one of them raised binoculars, the shape resolved into something that made him go silent. A man's body lay sprawled across the crossbeam, almost 80 feet above the ground. His clothes were stiff with weathering, his frame partly decomposed by 2 seasons of rain, snow, and birds. What struck them most was not the horror of it, but the impossibility. How could anyone have climbed that high without gear, without being seen? Forensic crews who arrived later struggled with a different question. Why had they spent nearly 2 years searching rivers, canyons, and trailheads when the missing man had been perched in plain sight, above an open clearing the whole time? The victim was eventually identified as Daniel Whitaker, a 32-year-old software technician from Fresno, California. In his short life, Daniel had been the type of man you'd hardly expect to become the center of a mystery. Middle class, steady, he worked for a regional IT firm that specialized in hospital databases. He loved hiking trips in the Sierras, photographed sunsets with a second-hand Nikon, and had recently bought a small handheld camcorder to capture road trips. He wasn't the kind of person who got into trouble. Friends described him as gentle, meticulous. His sister remembered how he used to catalog family photos by date, handwriting labels in block letters. His mother said he was a worrier, the sort of person who double-checked door locks before bed. In short, Daniel was ordinary, and that's exactly what makes his disappearance, and the bizarre place his body was found, so chilling. The story began in the summer of 1998, when Daniel decided to drive north to Oregon. He wanted to see the coastal range, stop in small towns, maybe reconnect with a college friend in Portland. It wasn't an impulsive escape. He'd taken vacation time, packed carefully, and told his family his route. To them, it felt like the kind of harmless adventure a quiet bachelor might take when he needed air. He entered Oregon in early August. Witnesses in a small logging town called Cascade Falls recalled seeing him. Tourists were rare there, especially ones carrying camera equipment, and locals remembered him asking about a scenic trail near the power line corridor. A waitress at the diner said he ate scrambled eggs and wrote in a small notebook. He stood out not because he was strange, but because he was polite, almost overly so. On the evening of August 10th, Daniel called his mother. The payphone record showed it was from a station on Route 26. He told her he planned to check into a motel a few miles down the road, grab some rest, and head west toward the coast in the morning. "I'll call you from the room," he promised. That call never came. The next day, his car was discovered abandoned at the edge of a Forest Service road. The doors were unlocked, keys still in the ignition. On the passenger seat was his Nikon camera, but the memory card was missing, as though someone had plucked it out with purpose. There was no wallet, no overnight bag, nothing to suggest a robbery. The air around the car smelled of damp pine. A crushed soda can lay near the rear wheel. For searchers who gathered there, it felt wrong from the start. Too neat, too posed. If a hiker had gone missing, they expected chaos, scattered gear, footprints into the brush. Instead, the vehicle felt staged, like a prop left for them to find. When investigators dug deeper, they found something that unsettled his mother most. Daniel had always had a fear of heights. He once froze halfway up a ladder while cleaning gutters, refusing to move until a neighbor coaxed him down. He avoided bridges, disliked glass elevators. That boy would never climb a tower, she told reporters, her voice breaking. Never. Not even on a dare. So how did he end up on top of one, in a place no one thought to look until it was too late? The coroner estimated he had been dead since late 1998, roughly when the searches first began. Yet the condition of his belongings, what little remained, suggested he hadn't simply fallen or collapsed. No climbing gear was recovered. No explanation for how he scaled a sheer lattice frame in darkness or why he would choose to. For 2 years, his name had been carried in missing persons bulletins, his family alternating between hope and dread. And all the while, his body had been there, exposed to the sky, invisible in plain sight. The shock of that discovery would ripple far beyond Oregon. But in those first hours, standing under the looming silhouette of the tower, one question rang louder than any other. If Daniel was terrified of heights, who or what put him up there? And why had they gone to such lengths to erase the path that led him there? Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, Bello. They organized the search the way small towns do when a stranger goes missing on their roads. Quickly, with more volunteers than anyone expected, and with a seriousness that suctions the air from normal life. Deputies strung cord and markers across the pullout where Daniel's sedan sat with its doors unlocked. A map on the hood sprouted circles in permanent marker. River bends, switchbacks, clear cuts, the tower corridor cutting a rigid line across the hills. By noon, the first line of volunteers moved into the timber. Lodgepole and fir, underbrush slick with dew. The air was cold enough to bite at exposed ears. A deputy briefed them on what to call out. Clothing, gear, anything that didn't belong. They walked at arm's length with heads down, the way people learn in rural places long before they learn to drive. 2 search dogs arrived from the county to the east. One, a black shepherd, found Daniel's scent from the driver's seat and pulled hard toward the tree line. The handler let her work, jog-trotting to keep up, the bell on her collar chiming a steady note. She cut across a game trail over a rotting log and broke toward the river, a narrow, fast-moving run that threw white at every rock. At the water's edge, she paced, nose to the spray, whining, then lifted her head and looked to the far bank. The handler stood in the current to her calves and shook his head. "It's like it stops here," he said. On their grid, someone wrote "Scent lost at river" and underlined it twice. The motel, 10 miles west on the highway, had a vacancy sign that buzzed when the rain hit it. The manager, a woman who had been counting on August fishermen to keep the place afloat, confirmed a reservation in Daniel's name. He had stopped earlier that afternoon, paid cash for the room, and said he might get dinner before checking in. "He asked for a ground-floor unit," she said. "Said he didn't like balconies." She'd stored a small canvas duffel behind the desk at his request, easier than leaving it in a car. When deputies opened it, they found shirts packed tight, a toothbrush still dry, and a spiral notebook the size of a paperback. Its cardboard cover softened by years. Inside, neat columns of block letters listed gear, mileage, phone numbers, a small sketch of a coastline he wanted to reach. Then, a gap. 3, maybe 4 pages removed with such care that the tier line ran straight and clean. No jagged edges, no lost scraps clinging to the spiral. It felt less like a diary interrupted and more like a record that someone had edited. Back at the search site, a university team arrived with what they called an aerial camera platform, a custom-built quadrotor with a VHS camcorder slung beneath. The thing sounded like a swarm of bees and lifted shakily into the gray. People stepped back and shaded their eyes. In 1998, drones were still the sort of contraption men in garages put together with hobby parts and hope. The operator kept it low, skimming the treetops, trying to pick up color against green. A jacket, a tarp, anything. When the battery sagged, it tilted and flopped gracelessly to the ground, propellers still spinning. The river went on, unsolved. Night dragged across the timber fast. Local men who knew the area drove the service roads slowly, windows cracked to hear. One of them, a farmer named Whitmore who rented pasture near the tree line, later told deputies he'd seen a pair of headlights deeper than any road he knew, moving parallel to the power corridor. They held for a minute, he said, squinting at the memory, like someone deciding, and then just... He opened his fingers. Gone. Like the switch flipped. No engine noise, no crunch of gravel. Just dark. Media arrived in their regular wave. A camera crew from Portland filmed the river and the sedan with its doors open and its emptiness. The local paper printed a photograph of Daniel pulled from his sister's fridge, his smile too big for the seriousness now draped over it. Talk radio did what talk radio does. Some callers said it was a random accident, some that he'd staged a disappearance. One insisted the forest eats people. Another claimed there were lights in those hills no one could explain. The deputies kept their answers clipped. They'd heard every theory 10 times in other cases. The work stayed the same. Walk, mark, log, repeat. A rumor spread among volunteers that the video camera found in the car, the Nikon's cassette mate, newer and gleaming, held nothing because the memory card slot was empty. That rumor was true. Deputies had opened the door and seen the camera on the passenger seat as if placed there for them, cradle-like, ready. The plastic door to the card slot hung ajar. Whoever last touched it had done so with steady hands. The sensation that somebody had staged the scene returned like a cold breath. On the third day, the family arrived from California. Daniel's mother stood in the clearing in a sweater too light for the wind and refused to be led back to the car. She kept looking up through the trees, as if the firs themselves might answer. When a reporter asked what she wanted people to know, she said, "He's careful. He's always careful." Then lower, more to herself than to any camera. "He hates heights. He won't even get on a ladder." The search moved outward. Civil Air Patrol flew a grid. A state police helicopter dipped low enough to rattle windows in the nearest houses. Deputies knocked on doors of cabins hidden off dirt tracks. One man handed over footage from a hunting camera. 3 deer and the shadow of a raccoon. No human shapes. A teenager swore he'd seen a man running along the tower right-of-way at dawn, but couldn't describe the clothes beyond dark. The right-of-way itself felt like a cut, a bright scar of gravel through green, humming faintly where the lines snapped with static in damp air. By week's end, the grid bled out into pencil marks and less certainty. The notebook with its missing pages sat in an evidence drawer, bagged and labeled. Deputies tried not to guess what those pages had contained. Phone numbers? Meeting times? A change of plan scribbled in panic? They kept their notes literal. When you're chasing shadows, fiction sneaks in wherever you let it. On the 7th morning, a lead deputy returned to the clearing where the car had been and followed a faint trace he hadn't seen before. Scuffs in the needles, a suggestion of weight. He called for a photographer and began to brush back debris with a gloved hand. Under the ferns, the ground revealed the pattern searchers dream of finding and dread once they do. 2 distinct shoe prints, heel and toe crisp where the duff had preserved them. They measured, photographed, cast with plaster. Then the deputy stood and looked up, not at the trees, but at the open space ahead. 10 feet away, the prints were still clear. 15, they softened. 20, they were gone. No drag, no turn. Just gone, as if the person had been plucked by an arm from above or had stepped onto something that left no mark at all. The deputy called the family liaison before he called the press, his voice carried carefully, words chosen so they wouldn't ignite the room. "We found shoe prints," he said, and then paused, the silence filling with breath and fear. "But they end," he finished, "right in the middle of the clearing." Autumn turned the hills the color of wet copper, and with the rain came a slowing no one wanted to admit aloud. The flyers curled on telephone poles. Volunteers went back to jobs and school runs. Deputies, bruised by so many empty grids, shifted to other calls: domestic disputes, elk poaching, a burglary at the feed store. Daniel Whitaker's file, thick with maps, thin with answers, slid from the edge of a desk toward the middle. The word people used was cooling. For his mother, no such season existed. She called the sheriff every Tuesday morning, same hour, same quiet question. "Have you found anything that wasn't there before?" 3 months after the car was found, a man in hip waders pushed through alder shoots along a feeder creek north of the highway. He was there for steelhead, head down, watching for the slight shift in current that made a pool worth the cast. Something blue snagged against a root wad where the water undercut the bank. At first he thought tarp, or a grocery bag caught from a storm. Up close, it was a backpack, nylon, the fabric slick with mud, one strap frayed clean through. He carried it to the ranger station, dripping. A deputy slit the zipper with a pocket knife and tipped the contents into a tray. 2 shirts rolled tight, a travel-sized bottle of ibuprofen, a Ziploc with granola mashed to flour. No wallet, no passport, no phone. At the bottom, shining under silt, lay a slug of metal the size of a thumb, irregular on one side, smooth on the other, like it had ridden against steel for a long time. It was heavy in the hand, in that way only forged things are. "Not camping gear," the deputy said, and bagged it separately. The creek was mapped. Upstream teams found no footprints, no torn fabric, no sign of where the pack began its travel. Downstream, the water braided into 3 channels and disappeared into blackberry tangles. The ranger shrugged. In winter, this whole cut can become a river. Anything loose will end up everywhere. Meanwhile, the motel manager remembered another detail that hadn't felt important until it did. A sedan idling in the far end of the lot, the afternoon Daniel stopped to book his room. Not a brand she could name. Older, dark, the driver wearing a cap pulled low. He didn't come to the office, didn't check in, just waited. "I thought he was with the fishing guys," she said. "They sometimes carpool and leave a car here." A clerk at a gas station down the highway pulled a tape from the security camera facing the pumps. Grainy as a snowstorm, the footage showed Daniel's car sliding past at dusk. 10 seconds later, another set of headlights followed. The second car stayed back 2 lengths, never pulling alongside. The make was impossible to tell. Glare smeared the pixels. The plate was a rectangle of flare. A rumor bloomed that the driver had taped over the numbers. The sheriff's office said there was no proof of that. Privately, a detective wrote, "Tail unknown." The volunteer who had walked dogs during the original week of searching called the tip line to report a sound he'd refused to write down at the time, for fear of sounding foolish. It was just before dawn on the 3rd day, he said, near the maintenance road that paralleled the right-of-way. He heard a metallic clatter far off, sharp, then hollow, then quiet. "Like chain on iron," he said. "Not a car door, something bigger. I thought maybe a gate. There's no gate out there." He'd circled toward it, but by the time he reached the cut where the towers marched away, all he could hear was the static tick of the line's bleeding charge into damp air. The sheriff reassigned the case to a younger detective who hadn't yet grown the hard shell you need to keep missing persons from waking you at night. She drove the route Daniel should have driven and walked the pullouts at odd hours. She sat in the motel room he had paid for and flipped the spiral notebook to the place where the neat columns stopped and the careful tear lines began. Whoever removed those pages had done it with a steady hand. No rip, no impatience. She pressed a blank sheet across the cardboard and shaded with a pencil, hoping for indented ghosts. The paper stayed clean. Winter came in off the Pacific like a shoulder. Snow dusted the corridor and then became crust, hiding and revealing at once. In January, a county commissioner asked on the radio why taxpayer money was still being used on a Californian who probably went off to start over. The host made sympathetic noises. Daniel's sister wrote a letter to the editor that said only, "He would have called me." February thawed into mud. A logger flagged down a deputy near mile marker 112 to report that one of the tower step bolts on his morning route looked not right, as if something had hung from it and been yanked free. The deputy nodded, wrote it down, and kept going. Towers were the utilities' concern. The county dealt with what happened on the ground. The metal piece from the backpack went to the state lab wrapped in lint-free cloth. The first analyst called it industrial, likely steel or aluminum alloy, with evidence of galvanizing. A second analyst measured the radius of the curve and the thread pattern on one scar and frowned. "Not from a car," she said. "Not consumer hardware." She ran acid over a corner to chase the gray away and brought up a stamp. A faint B72, and beneath it, a code that looked half like a date and half like a serial. She paged through a 3-inch binder of fasteners and clamps used in power transmission and put her finger down hard. "I want to send this to BPA," she said, meaning the big federal utility whose lines stitched these hills together. "They'll know the spec." While she waited for a reply, the detective went back to the creek where the backpack had snared. She stood on the slick bank and tried to picture the pack's journey. The hand that shoved it into current, or the foot that slipped and dropped it there by accident. If it had been dumped, it was a lazy dump. Half evidence, half message. Wallet and passport removed, but ibuprofen left. Food left. A chunk of metal tucked inside as if to weight it down, and then forgotten when the strap snagged on a root. That choice felt like a mistake someone made after a long night. The utility wrote back in 3 days. The part, they said, appeared to be a fragment from a Stockbridge damper clamp. The counterweight assembly technicians bolt to high-voltage conductors to reduce wind vibration. The B72 stamp matched a series installed on the corridor in the late 1980s. Under magnification, the lab could see wear consistent with long-term exposure to harmonic oscillation. Minute movements, hour after hour, day after day, until the clamp cracked and was replaced or fell. "You find these under lines sometimes," the utility engineer wrote, "but they usually stay near the right-of-way. You don't find them in a backpack." The detective read the sentence twice. It put the river, the pack, the part, and the corridor into the same sentence the case had been trying to write from the beginning. It didn't say tower, but it pointed straight at one. While the lab report was still warm, a leak from inside the sheriff's office rolled downhill through town. A traffic camera had caught a shadow car behind Daniels. The talk shows called it a mystery tale. Old-timers in the diner swore it was government or criminals or both. The kind of either-or that makes people feel like they're onto something. The detective didn't indulge any of it. She circled "Why missing pages? Why missing card?" and drew a line to tail car, and then another to metal from line. Daniel's mother, who had started to dream of her son calling from a payphone that no longer existed, came to the station to hold the backpack, or at least the plastic that held it. She didn't cry this time. She pressed her palm to the bag and said, "He would have packed it like that. Even when he was little, he put heavy things on the bottom." The detective asked if Daniel had any connection to utilities. He did not. Any climbing experience? He hated heights. The answer came like a reflex. The sentence had become as fundamental to the family as his birthday. A week later, the lab called with the inevitable conclusion the detective already had in her notes. "Your fragment," the analyst said, "is definitely industrial. Transmission hardware, not consumer, not automotive, from a high-voltage corridor." She paused. "From those towers." The detective stared at the phone after the line went dead. For months, the case had been about what the ground would reveal: prints, trash, an angle through brush missed before. Now the ground had pointed upward. The backpack had carried a clue the whole time, heavy and dumb, waiting for someone to name it. And if that piece had ridden in Daniel's bag, he had been close enough to one of those lines to pick it up, or close enough to someone who worked there. The river hissed through alders. The clearing where the shoe prints ended lay under a gray sky that made the tower's lattice look like bones. On paper, the case tilted. It would not be the last time. The backpack didn't thaw the case so much as tilt it. After months of rain and rumor, a piece of metal in a nylon pocket had finally given investigators something heavy enough to hold. The State Lab's first report named it, a fragment from a Stockbridge damper clamp used on high-voltage lines, but the second report changed the temperature of the room. Under magnification, the fracture face wasn't the soft scallop of a part that had shaken itself apart in the wind. It was flat and bright, with parallel striations marching in one direction. A university metallurgist the lab consulted wrote, almost apologetically, that the surface bore tool kerfing consistent with manual or powered cutting, hacksaw or abrasive wheel. Along the edge, a burr curled outward, evidence the cut had been pushed through, not torn by fatigue. Someone hadn't found a broken piece. Someone had made one. The detective read the paragraph twice. An accident could be explained. A deliberate cut asked who and why. When the finding leaked, utility workers bristled. "Nobody cuts hardware off a live line," a current foreman told a reporter. "You'd be ash." But a retired lineman called the newsroom from a number blocked with tape and told a different story. He'd worked that corridor in the late 90s. He remembered night traffic up there on weekends that weren't on any schedule. Headlights creeping along the service track, engines killed near the base of structures, as if someone wanted to be there without being seen. "We'd come out Monday," he said, voice low, "and find cigarette butts where no one was supposed to be. Once we found a ladder we didn't own lying in the brush. Somebody liked to be near those towers after dark. Maybe teenagers, maybe scavengers, maybe something else. We logged it. Nothing happened." He wouldn't give his name. "His pension," he said. "His wife's health insurance." He hung up before the reporter could ask more. By then, Daniel's family had learned to jump at every ring. The anonymous call arrived on a Tuesday night, a few minutes after 9. Caller ID read "out of area." His mother let it go once, then picked up on the second pass. A woman's voice, calm, not hurried, said, "Your son didn't die where you think." No greeting, no explanation. The line clicked dead. The sheriff's office traced it to a payphone outside a truck stop 20 miles south. The security camera over the coffee counter recorded to a tape that was swapped out every morning and reused until the magnetic band went snowblind. By the time deputies got there, whatever faces had leaned into the plastic receiver were already recorded over by daylight. The call hollowed the family differently than the others. For a year they had pictured the river, the trees, the clearing where the footprints ended. They had built a private geography of grief around those coordinates. The voice moved their map without telling them where to set it down. In town, the talk shifted from misadventure to intention. Missing notebook pages. A memory card removed. A utility part cut, not broken. The contour of the story no longer matched the lines of ordinary bad luck. If someone had walked Daniel to the edge of a clearing and made his footprints stop, what else had they staged for people to find later? The detective drove the corridor again, this time carrying the lab report like a compass. The towers rose at precise intervals across cut ground, a geometry humans grafted onto hills. At Tower 47, where volunteers had first reported the faint metallic clank at dawn, she parked on the apron of crushed rock and walked the perimeter with a camera and a measuring wheel. The right-of-way hummed even on a dry day, static, pulling at the hair on her arms. She wasn't alone. A man in a county windbreaker stood with a utility map folded to the tower sites. He'd come to talk about safety, about why civilians had no business near steel. He said he'd worked lines for 25 years and had never seen anything like this. He kept glancing at the base plates, like they might answer for themselves. 50 yards downslope, a patch of mud remained damp where water seeped from a spring. Someone had walked a truck through it in the last week. 2 ruts, crisp edges, rain spatter hardened like a crust. The detective crouched and pressed a ruler to the tread. The lugs bit deep. The pattern showed a center rib and staggered blocks, the kind of all-terrain tire a rancher or contractor runs. Wheelbase, measured from center line to center line, suggested a mid-size pickup. The marks didn't angle toward the service road that led back to the highway. They flowed the other way, east, onto a narrower track no one on the search teams had logged. She followed as far as brambles allowed, then doubled back to photograph the start, the middle, the exit. A deputy mixed dental stone and poured it carefully into a print. They carried away the cast like a cake. That afternoon, a stringer from the local weekly caught up with a former contractor who had done vegetation work along the corridor back then. Over coffee, he said he'd been told not to ask when he arrived early one morning and found a padlock open on a gate that was always closed at night. I figured it was a crew I didn't know, he shrugged, but the rigs I saw out there didn't have company tags. He couldn't remember dates. He did remember the feeling in his gut. The place did not belong to him that day. The sheriff tried to tamp down talk of plots. At the weekly press gaggle, he said the lab results were one piece among many, that anonymous calls were unreliable at best, that tire tracks are common in rural areas and not inherently suspicious. But the file told its own story, regardless of what he said on the courthouse steps. The lab report's photographs of tool marks were clearer than any speech. The photograph of the cut face looked like a fingerprint left by a blade. The detective returned to the motel manager with a list of license plates that had checked in the week Daniel paid for his room. One entry hadn't matched a vehicle. The number was off by a digit, transposed by a tired clerk at midnight. When they corrected it, it resolved into a pickup registered to a timber subcontractor 3 counties away. The company had since closed. Its owner had moved to Idaho. Another letter to chase, another door to knock. In the evidence room, the rucksack hung on a peg, dried and tagged. The fragment sat in a foam cradle as if it were a relic. The detective thought of the anonymous voice and the sentence it had dropped like a stone. He didn't die where you think. The phrasing was deliberate. Not he isn't there. Not you'll find him somewhere else. It answered the river, not the corridor. If he didn't die at the water's edge, what had the river been used for? To carry the pack, perhaps. To make searchers spend time in the wrong places, while the right place stood above them, visible if you only tilted your chin. Late one evening, she parked beneath Tower 47 again and listened. It was colder now. The wind pushed whistle tones through the lattice so that the structure seemed to breathe. On a base plate, a faint smear of dark, old grease, caught the light. She wiped it with a sterile swab anyway. Habit. The mud at the apron had dried, but the tire tracks held their shape. She walked them to the point where they left the right-of-way entirely and dove into Salal. The compass needle twitched. East. She looked west, toward the forest road where Daniel's sedan had waited, with its doors unlocked and its camera open like a polite invitation. That road and this track never touched. No loop connected them. If a man had been moved from one to the other, he had not walked. Someone had driven him, first here, then elsewhere, and left the car as a decoy. The detective stood with her boots at the edge of the ruts and did what investigators do when evidence refuses to draw a straight line. She imagined the missing steps, a night vehicle that didn't show up on anyone's clipboard, a part cut from a place ordinary people never climb, a backpack seeded with hardware as if to plant an answer that would take months to sprout. Back at the office, she pinned a new photo to the board, the tire cast beside a ruler, the angle of the blocks like teeth. Threaded beneath were 3 cards: cut hardware, night presence at tower, call, didn't die where you think. The arrows converged on a red circle at Tower 47. The next morning, deputies returned to the site with a wider grid. They walked the eastern spur until they hit a gate choked by alder and vine maple. The lock was new. The fence beside it was not. Someone had bent and rebent the wire until it carried the tired look of a thing that keeps being undone. The sheriff, standing by the cruiser, said again that tire tracks are just tire tracks. The detective kept her eyes on the ruts that ran away from the tower in the opposite direction from Daniel's car. Even without a single witness, the ground had spoken. Whatever began here, left here. And it didn't head toward the place where a sedan waited with keys in the ignition and a camera with its memory deliberately erased. That was not the last contradiction they would find. It was simply the first one they could cast in stone. If this story touched you, even a little, let me know in the comments. We read them all. The discovery of the tire ruts and the cut fragment of tower hardware shifted the focus squarely onto Daniel himself. Investigators realized that to understand why he ended up near the high-voltage corridor, they had to know what he was carrying with him long before he set foot in Oregon. They began with his purchases. Credit card records showed that in the weeks before the trip, Daniel had ordered a bundle of unusual maps. Not the glossy hiking guides tourists buy at gas stations, but technical topographic charts, gridded surveys that marked power easements, transmission corridors, and industrial zones. A clerk at a San Jose supply store remembered him because he'd asked if they had older revisions of certain charts. He wasn't looking for new trails, the clerk told reporters. He wanted places most people don't look at. That detail troubled his family. Daniel had always loved the outdoors, but his trips usually meant a trailhead, a camera, and a couple of hours of solitude. He wasn't the type to pore over infrastructure schematics. Something had redirected his curiosity. At his old job in Silicon Valley, colleagues filled in pieces. Daniel had been a quiet engineer, someone who stayed late to solve problems no one else wanted. But a coworker remembered him saying, weeks before he left, that he had found something in the data. The man assumed it meant code, some bug in a project they'd been working on. Looking back, he wasn't so sure. He told me, word for word, If what I think is true, it's bigger than me. It's not just software. He never explained further. That comment grew teeth when investigators searched his computer. On his desktop, they found a small, heavily encrypted file labeled only Vault. Analysts spent weeks trying to break it open, but never succeeded. The presence of such a file fueled speculation. Was Daniel documenting something he had stumbled across? Was the file the reason he had traveled north? Journalists dug into his recent history for context. What they discovered complicated the image of a man on vacation. Daniel had requested weeks off, longer than any trip he'd taken before. He'd told his supervisor he needed time to reset. But his internet search history in the days before leaving suggested something more pointed. Transmission tower schematics, transformer station maps, and even environmental impact reports tied to a private energy contractor that operated in Oregon. Why those documents? Why that company? Nobody could say. But the fact that his backpack contained a piece of tower hardware suddenly looked less like coincidence and more like a breadcrumb. His family pushed back against the implication that Daniel was engaged in anything illicit. To them, he was a hiker, a son who loved to film redwood groves, not a man chasing corporate corruption. But in his notebooks, the ones recovered from his motel room, investigators noticed something chilling. Several pages had been carefully removed with a razor blade. The cuts were clean, deliberate. Whatever had been written there, someone had decided those words could not remain. The missing pages became a phantom in the case. Were they notes about the trip? Sketches of maps? Names? No one knew. But his sister recalled something that made her stomach turn. A week before leaving, Daniel had called her late at night and asked, "Do you remember the power corridor we passed driving up the coast years ago? The one with the towers on the ridge?" She said yes, vaguely. "I think I need to go back there," he said. "There's something wrong with it." What could possibly be wrong with steel towers that had stood since the 60s? She assumed he was joking. He wasn't. Investigators traced his steps backward. Gas receipts placed him in Northern California, 2 days before he disappeared. One showed he'd filled up near Redding, where surveillance footage confirmed his car. He looked ordinary. Plaid shirt, jeans, a styrofoam cup of coffee. Yet on the passenger seat sat a folded set of charts that the clerk in San Jose swore were the same ones he had purchased. He drove north, straight toward the Oregon border, straight toward the grid of towers he had been mapping. At this stage, theories split in two. One painted Daniel as a man drawn too deeply into his own obsessions, an amateur sleuth convinced he was onto something, who wandered into a landscape that didn't forgive mistakes. The other framed him as a witness. If he had found evidence of illegal activity, environmental dumping, energy theft, or something darker, then someone might have followed him north to stop him. The erased memory card in his camera fit this version all too neatly. His mother, sorting through old photographs, noticed something the detectives had missed. In a shoebox of prints Daniel had mailed her years earlier was a picture of the very tower where his body would later be found. It wasn't a close shot, just part of a landscape he'd captured while driving. But the outline was unmistakable. The cross arms, the lattice work. On the back of the photo, in Daniel's handwriting, was a single word: marker. That detail shattered her. He had seen the tower long before his final trip. He had singled it out. And whatever marker meant, it was important enough for him to write down. The revelation meant Daniel had not stumbled into that corridor by chance. He had chosen it. He had, at minimum, flagged the structure years before as significant. Whether for beauty, for engineering, or for secrets only he knew, that tower had already been part of his story. Detectives were forced to ask, If Daniel had drawn a circle around that tower in his mind, had someone else known he was coming back to it? The line between curiosity and danger blurred further. To the sheriff's office, Daniel might have been a wanderer who went too far. But to his family, and to the journalists who smelled a larger story, he was a man silenced before he could tell anyone what he had found. And in the silence, a question sharpened. Who had erased the card? Who had taken the notebook pages? And who else had looked at that tower and seen a marker worth keeping? By the summer of 2001, the case was unraveling into contradictions. Every new clue widened the gulf between what authorities insisted and what the family believed. Officially, Daniel had vanished during a solo hike. Unofficially, the evidence refused to stay in line. The first disruption came from a man who wandered into the sheriff's office on a hot July afternoon. He was a logger, now living in Idaho, but he swore he had been in that same Oregon town the week after Daniel's disappearance. He claimed he had seen him at a roadside bar, a tall, thin man in dusty clothes with a split lip, hunched over a glass of water. He looked spooked, the logger said, like he was waiting for somebody, but hoping they wouldn't come. Deputies brushed it off as mistaken identity, but the description matched Daniel's build, and the detail of the cut across the face matched a scratch family members had noticed in an earlier police photograph of his car seat. The possibility that Daniel had been alive days longer than the timeline suggested rattled his mother. She clung to it with a mix of hope and horror. If he had survived the first night, what had happened to him afterward? Then came the fire. In late August, smoke rose from the ridge where the transmission tower stood. Fire crews put it out before it spread, but the burn pattern told a strange story. It was concentrated in a tight radius near the base of the structure, as though someone had poured accelerant directly on the ground. Nothing else around it had been touched. It didn't behave like a natural brush fire, the fire marshal told reporters off the record. To Daniel's sister, it felt like an erasure attempt, as if someone wanted to cleanse the area of traces no one had yet found. When investigators returned to inspect the tower after the fire, they noticed something even stranger. High on one of the support struts, well above human reach, crude markings had been gouged into the steel. Letters, uneven, jagged, yet legible. 2 initials, DM, the same as Daniel's. It was physically impossible to explain. To carve at that height required climbing gear or a bucket lift. Daniel owned neither, and the corrosion on the steel suggested the scratches had been there for some time, perhaps overlapping with the period of his disappearance. Investigators argued over what it meant. Was it his attempt to leave a trace, a signal, or a cruel forgery by someone who knew his name? The family visited the site escorted by deputies. Standing under the tower, craning their necks, they saw the initials themselves. The mother wept silently, repeating his name under her breath. His sister photographed them and tucked the print into her jacket. "If he put those there," she said later, "he wanted us to know he'd been here. He wanted us to find him." But the official narrative kept hardening. Detectives cited lack of conclusive evidence and prepared the paperwork to close the investigation. They told the family there were no new leads, that Daniel's likely fate was a fall or exposure somewhere in the woods. It was the same formula so many families heard. A quiet admission that nothing more would be done. Then fate intervened again, by accident. An electrical crew was dispatched to the same tower in early September, tasked with routine maintenance on the high-voltage line. One lineman climbed the lattice, ascending into the late summer haze. At the very top, near the crossarm, he froze. Wedged awkwardly between beams was the unmistakable outline of a human form. He shouted down to the crew below. Silence fell across the clearing. They had come expecting bolts and wires. Instead, they had found a body. Authorities rushed to the scene, cordoning off the area. The remains were in terrible condition, weathered, skeletal, exposed to the elements for an unthinkable stretch of time. But there was no doubt. After 2 years of searching valleys, creeks, and back roads, Daniel had been found perched at the summit of a steel tower, a place no one had thought to look. The recovery left more questions than it answered. How could a man terrified of heights, as his mother had always insisted, have climbed such a structure? Why was his car abandoned miles away, keys left inside, as if he had never intended to stray far? And who had wiped the memory card, removed the notebook pages, phoned the family with cryptic warnings? The official line was thin. He must have climbed under duress or in disorientation. But to those who knew him, that explanation collapsed under its own weight. Daniel had avoided ladders, hated balconies, even laughed off invitations to ride Ferris wheels. The idea that he scaled a 150-foot lattice alone in the dark was almost cruel in its absurdity. His sister stared up at the skeletal frame where he had been lodged. She whispered the words he once wrote on the back of that photo. Marker. Now the tower was not just a marker. It was a grave. But the strangest twist came as technicians dismantled parts of the structure to remove the remains. Wedged between 2 beams, close to where the initials had been scratched, they found a scrap of fabric. It wasn't Daniel's clothing. It was a strip of heavy canvas, industrial, printed faintly with numbers that looked like part of an equipment label. When the evidence was bagged, one worker muttered, "That's not from him. That's from somebody who works up here." The family, watching from the dirt road below, realized what that implied. If Daniel had been up there, he hadn't been alone. The tower became more than just steel and wires the moment the recovery team brought Daniel's remains down. What should have been closure only fractured the story further. The official autopsy report arrived within a week. Cause of death: electrocution. On paper it sounded neat, almost routine. But the details leaking from the morgue painted a picture that didn't fit. Daniel's body hadn't been twisted in the violent spasm expected from a live shock. Instead, he had been discovered in a strangely composed position, his torso slumped as if set down rather than thrown by a current. Technicians who climbed up first whispered that it felt staged, that a man had been placed where they found him. Worse were the marks on his wrists. Thin abrasions, parallel and raw even after years of weathering. A forensic pathologist, speaking quietly to a journalist friend, admitted, "They looked like ligature impressions. Rope, maybe. Nothing you'd expect from a climber holding steel." The family was stunned. His mother clutched the report with trembling hands, repeating what she had said from the beginning. He would never have climbed, and if he had, why would his wrists look like that? Then came the discovery in the grass around the tower. Scattered in the dirt, half buried by ash from the suspicious fire, lay broken pieces of an old film camera. The casing was cracked, the lens shattered, but tucked inside the rusted shell was a roll of 35mm film. Somehow, despite heat and rain, a portion of the negatives had survived. Police labs worked slowly, but a technician managed to recover a handful of frames. The images were grainy, blurred by motion and age. Yet certain details chilled everyone who saw them. Shapes of human figures, 3, maybe 4, standing near the base of the tower at night. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces indistinct. But the suggestion was unmistakable. Daniel had not been alone. The frames were leaked to the press. In one, a sliver of Daniel's sleeve was visible, white against the dark background. Another showed what might have been a pair of hands reaching toward him. Officially, investigators said the photos were too degraded to provide evidentiary value. Privately, even some detectives admitted it looked like surveillance of a crime in progress. The atmosphere around the case thickened into something oppressive. The family's phone rang at odd hours, silence on the other end, sometimes a faint hum like electrical static. Local journalists reported being followed leaving town meetings. Every piece of the puzzle that surfaced seemed to come with a warning not to look further. And then the package arrived. It was a small padded envelope, no return address, dropped through the mail slot at Daniel's mother's house late one evening. She thought at first it might be another sympathy card. People still sent them, years after the disappearance, but when she opened it, the contents made her knees buckle. Inside was a torn fragment of Daniel's passport, the corner with his photograph and name. It was stiff, the paper warped, stained with a brownish residue. Laboratory testing later confirmed what the eye already suspected: dried human blood. There was no note, no demand, no explanation. Just the silent horror of proof that someone had handled his most personal documents after his death. The sheriff's office insisted it was probably a cruel hoax, maybe planted by someone obsessed with the case. Yet the blood type matched Daniel's. For the family, it was confirmation of their darkest suspicion, that his death was not an accident at all, but the product of hands that wanted him silenced. That night, his sister sat at the kitchen table staring at the fragment under a lamp. "This isn't over," she whispered. "Whoever sent this wants us to know it's bigger than we ever thought." And for the first time, even the most skeptical neighbors began to believe she was right. The arrival of the passport fragment should have ignited urgency, but instead, it was met with silence. Not the silence of grief, but the heavy, deliberate kind, where phones went unanswered and officials shuffled papers as though the less said, the better. Daniel's family quickly learned how thick that silence could become. Within weeks, 2 private investigators who had been looking into the case, both former law enforcement, reported unnerving encounters. One described his brakes failing on a highway curve, only to discover afterward that his car's lines had been cut. Another found his front door ajar and a strange symbol carved into the wood, a crude lightning bolt, etched deep. Neither went to the police. "What's the point?" one of them told a reporter off the record. "It's the same people who'd be investigating." Both men quit the case the same month. Journalists fared no better. One Portland freelancer covering the inconsistencies received anonymous notes slid under her hotel room door. "Stop asking about the tower." She checked out the next morning. And yet fragments of truth still leaked out, carried by those who couldn't quite hold their tongues. A man who had once worked for the regional energy company agreed to speak under condition of anonymity. His voice shook as he spoke on tape. "He saw something," he said. "Something he wasn't supposed to. That's all I'll say." When pressed for details, what did Daniel see? What was he chasing? The man hung up. His phone disconnected the next day, and attempts to trace him ended in a deadline. Then there was the encrypted file found on Daniel's home computer, finally cracked open by a digital forensics team. Most of it remained scrambled gibberish, but one sheet emerged intact. It was a scanned map of the surrounding mountains and valleys. Circled in red ink were 5 high-voltage transmission towers, scattered like pins across the landscape. Next to one was a small cross and a single word typed in block letters: evidence. For his sister, the revelation landed like a hammer. "He knew," she said. "He wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He marked it. He had proof of something." Theories spun wildly. Had Daniel stumbled onto a corporate cover-up? Perhaps illegal dumping near transmission lines? Or was it something more sinister? Experimental equipment, secret government projects buried in plain sight. Meanwhile, locals whispered of strange events around the time he vanished. A farmer swore he'd seen headlights bouncing along the dirt access road to the tower at nearly midnight, only to blink out all at once. Another resident remembered hearing what sounded like an explosion in the hills, though no fire was ever reported. Still, nothing compared to the shock of what surfaced in the local paper, tucked in the back section beneath high school sports scores. Just a few paragraphs. An unidentified man attempted to breach the perimeter of Bonneville substation late Friday. Guards reported he scaled part of the fence before fleeing into the night. Authorities were unable to detain him. The article might have passed unnoticed if not for the detail offered by a witness. A teenager walking home claimed the man's face caught in the glow of a security light. He looked like that guy, the one from the posters, the missing tourist. Daniel. But the date on the article was months after his official disappearance, before his body was found. The family pored over the clipping, their hands trembling. His mother refused to let it go. "They're lying," she whispered. "Either he was alive longer than they told us, or someone wanted us to think he was." And so the silence grew heavier, the unanswered questions louder. The narrative that had once seemed straightforward, a hiker lost, a tragic accident, was unraveling thread by thread. In its place came something far darker, the suggestion of surveillance, manipulation, and a chain of people willing to risk everything to keep the truth buried. The broken camera, the blurred figures in the photos, the encrypted maps, the threats, they all pointed toward a network much larger than one man's disappearance. What Daniel had seen, and why it had cost him his life, remained locked in the shadows. But the package with his passport had been a message. Someone out there wanted the family to know he hadn't simply fallen victim to chance. And if the report in the newspaper was to be believed, maybe he hadn't fallen victim at all, at least not right away. The clipping sat on the kitchen table for weeks, its edges worn from constant handling. No one in Daniel's family could let it rest. The grainy description of a man vaulting a fence, the brief witness remark, "He looked like that guy from the posters," gnawed at them. If true, it meant everything they'd been told was wrong, but it was the envelope that arrived 2 months later that broke whatever faith they had left in the official story. It came with no return address, slid into the mailbox sometime during the night. Inside was a single photograph, printed on glossy paper. Daniel stood in the frame, alive. He was thinner, his face drawn, his eyes sunken. But it was him. Behind him loomed the lattice frame of the very transmission tower where his remains had supposedly been found. The photograph's timestamp, faint in one corner, was dated months after his official death. His mother nearly collapsed. "He was alive," she whispered, clutching the picture to her chest. "They knew, and they left him there." Investigators pushed back, of course. They called it a fake, a cruel manipulation. But when the family hired independent experts to analyze the print, the verdict came back clear. No signs of digital tampering. The film grain, the chemical residue on the paper, the aging, all consistent with authentic development from that exact period. Around the same time, a journalist who had been combing through corporate archives unearthed a folder of shredded documents. Pieced together painstakingly, the fragments revealed chilling phrases: experimental site monitoring, anomalous exposure data, contract with federal subcontractor. Every page bore the letterhead of the regional energy company. It wasn't proof of murder, not directly, but it was evidence of something larger. activities around those towers that were never meant to see daylight. For Daniel's sister, the connection was immediate. "He was mapping them," she said, pointing back to the decrypted file from his computer. "He circled one and wrote evidence. He found out what they were doing. That's why he ended up there." And yet, the details refused to settle neatly. The camera fragments found at the base of the tower, why were the surviving frames of shadowy figures so perfectly ruined? The slashed brake lines on the investigator's car, the anonymous threats, all of it wove into a pattern of deliberate obstruction, a chain of silence enforced with menace. By late 2001, the case was once again declared closed. Death by electrocution while trespassing on restricted property. That was the official verdict. The family was told to move on. But how could they, when the photograph still sat in their drawer, staring back at them? In the spring, his mother traveled to Oregon herself. She drove the winding road up into the hills and stood at the base of the tower where his body had been discovered. The steel frame groaned in the wind, humming faintly with current. She tilted her head back, staring up into the dizzying height where workers had found what little was left of him. For a moment, in the low electric drone, she swore she heard his voice. Not words, not even sound, but the shape of his name, threaded through the wires. Neighbors said she stayed there for hours, unmoving, until the sun slipped down. The story might have ended there, left as one more cold case wrapped in layers of secrecy. But the hills had one last revelation to offer. That summer, teenagers trespassing near another transmission line stumbled across something horrific. A body, curled against the highest platform of a neighboring tower. Different man, different clothes, same impossible location. The discovery sent ripples through the community. Was it coincidence, a macabre copycat, or the continuation of whatever chain had pulled Daniel into its orbit? No one could say. And so the story of one vanished tourist refused to fade. Each answer only birthed more questions. Why the maps? Why the missing camera card? Who sent the photograph? And what message were they trying to deliver? In the end, what remained was the silence. Of companies, of agencies, of officials who never seemed surprised, only inconvenienced. The silence, and the mother who still insists her son didn't die the way they claimed.